My wife told me I wasn't romantic anymore, so I planned the biggest surprise of our relationship to prove her wrong. She cried the moment she saw it, but not for the reason I expected. It took me months to understand that I had spent 6 years solving the wrong problem entirely. By the time I finally understood what she actually needed from me, she had already stopped waiting for me to figure it out. If you had asked me a year ago whether my girlfriend and I were happy, I would have laughed at the question. Of course we were happy. We'd been together for 6 years at that point, since we were 22 and 23 years old, both of us fresh out of university and convinced we already knew everything about how adult life was supposed to work. We had an apartment we'd picked out together. We had 2 cars, both paid off. We had a dog, a scrappy little rescue mutt named Biscuit that we'd adopted together in our second year of living together. We had a shared savings account that we both contributed to religiously. We had already more than once had the kind of half-serious, half-joking conversation about marriage that couples have when they both already know the answer but haven't gotten around to making it official. Our friends used to call us the old married couple of the group, the ones who'd clearly figured it out while everyone else was still cycling through situationships and bad Tinder dates. I loved her. I want to say that clearly right at the start of this, because I think it matters for understanding how confusing everything that happened afterward was for me. This wasn't a story about someone who fell out of love and slowly checked out. I loved her the entire time, right up until the day she left, and honestly I still do, in whatever complicated way you love someone who used to be the center of your whole life. That's exactly what makes this so hard to explain to people. When she eventually left, there was no cheating involved, not on either side. There was no secret boyfriend waiting in the wings. There was no single explosive fight that either of us could point to and say, that's the night it ended. There wasn't a betrayal in any of the ways I'd always understood betrayal to work. She simply sat me down one evening, calm in a way that somehow felt worse than yelling would have, and told me, I'm tired of being your girlfriend and your mother at the same time. I laughed. I actually laughed, a short, surprised bark of a laugh, because it sounded like the setup to a joke, not the opening line of the end of a 6-year relationship. I thought she was exaggerating, venting after a hard day, the kind of thing you say and then walk back an hour later once you've cooled off. She wasn't exaggerating, and she never walked it back. I think to understand how we got there, I need to actually walk you through what our day-to-day life looked like, because none of it seemed dramatic at the time. It seemed to me at least completely normal, unremarkable, the ordinary texture of a long relationship between 2 working adults. My name in this story is Ethan. I'm a software engineer, 29 years old now. My schedule was predictable in a way I actually liked. I worked from 9 to 5, sometimes a little later depending on what sprint we were in, came home around 6 most nights, had dinner with my girlfriend, whom I'll call Mia, and then most evenings, somewhere around 8 o'clock, I'd sit down and turn on my PlayStation for a couple of hours before bed. I want to be specific about the gaming part of this story, because I think it's easy to read a headline like the one on this post, and assume this is just another lazy gamer boyfriend story, and I don't think that's actually accurate, or at least it's not the full picture. I played online most nights with the same core group of guys I'd known since college, 4 of us who'd been running the same rotating cast of games together for almost a decade at that point. It was as much about the friendships as it was about the games themselves. Mia knew all of this from the very beginning of our relationship. She wasn't blindsided by discovering 3 years in that her boyfriend liked video games. In fact, she'd bought me the headset I used, a genuinely nice one, for my birthday 2 years earlier. She bought me games for Christmas more than once, specific titles she knew I'd been wanting, because she paid attention to the things I mentioned wanting even in passing. So whenever she'd bring up, even lightly, even as a passing comment, something about how much I gamed, some small part of my brain would immediately think, but you knew who I was when we got together. You bought me the headset. You're the one who wrapped that PlayStation game under the Christmas tree with a little bow on it. That thought, looking back on it now, was my first real mistake, even though it took me an embarrassingly long time to recognize it as one. Because being someone's partner isn't a lifetime contract that locks in, permanently, exactly how you behaved in the earliest years of the relationship, as though any request for something different later on is somehow a violation of the original terms. People change, needs change. What felt like a reasonable, comfortable rhythm at 23 doesn't necessarily still feel reasonable at 28. Once careers get more demanding, once a household gets more complicated, once the sheer accumulated weight of daily responsibilities starts to add up in ways that neither person fully accounts for. I didn't understand any of that yet. Not really. Not in a way that had actually sunk in. The first real crack, the one I can look back on now and identify clearly, happened on an ordinary Thursday evening that I wouldn't have remembered at all if it hadn't turned out to matter so much later. Mia came home from the grocery store carrying 4 or 5 heavy bags, having stopped on her way back from work like she did most weeks, since grocery runs had, without either of us ever explicitly deciding it, become something she just handled. I was already sitting on the couch mid-match, headset on, when she walked in. She stood in the doorway to the living room for a second, bags digging into her forearms, and asked, "Can you help me with these?" I paused the game, genuinely intending to help. "Give me 5 minutes," I said. She looked at me, then she looked down at the bags, then back at me. "Okay," she said, and carried them into the kitchen herself. 5 minutes became 20, because the match I'd paused wasn't actually the kind of match you can just pause and resume cleanly, and by the time it wrapped up I'd already half forgotten what I was supposed to be doing. When I finally wandered into the kitchen, everything was already put away. The bags were folded and stored under the sink where we kept them for reuse. The refrigerator was organized. She was standing at the counter starting to chop vegetables for dinner. "Thanks," I said, feeling like I'd done something generous simply by acknowledging it. She didn't answer. Not sharply, not with any visible anger, just a kind of quiet non-response that I chalked up, at the time, to her having had a hard day at work. It genuinely did not occur to me that it might have anything to do with me at all. I remember actually thinking, as I grabbed a drink from the fridge and wandered back to the living room, that I hoped whatever was bothering her at the office would sort itself out soon. Over the following weeks, a pattern started to emerge that, at the time, felt like nothing more than the normal, mundane back and forth of two people sharing a life together. Mia started asking me for small things, specific concrete requests, nothing unreasonable on their own. "Can you make dinner tonight?" She'd ask and I'd say sure, meaning it. "Can you do the laundry this weekend?" And I'd say yeah, tomorrow, meaning that too. "Can you call the landlord about the leak under the sink?" And I'd say after work, I'll call during my lunch break, fully intending to. "Can you book Biscuit's vet appointment? He's due for his shots." And I'd say I'll do it this weekend, and I would write myself a mental note that would more often than not dissolve into the general fog of my week within a day or two. Here's the part that I think is important to understand, because it's the part that took me the longest to be honest with myself about. I wasn't lying to her. Not deliberately, not consciously. In the moment I said each of those things, I fully meant them. I wasn't some cartoonishly selfish boyfriend nodding along while planning to do nothing. But somehow consistently, without any dramatic moment where I explicitly decided not to follow through, those tasks kept ending up back in Mia's hands. The laundry would get done, but she'd be the one doing it. The landlord would get called, but by her, a day after I'd said I would and hadn't. The vet appointment would get booked, quietly, without me ever noticing that it had happened, until Biscuit came home from a routine visit I hadn't known was even scheduled. And because our apartment stayed clean, because the bills always got paid on time, because there was always food in the fridge and dog food in the pantry and toilet paper under the sink, I fell into a kind of comfortable, unexamined assumption that everything was fine. Better than fine, actually. From where I was sitting, our life together looked like it was running smoothly, like a well-oiled machine, and it genuinely never occurred to me to ask myself whose hands were actually oiling it. The first real fight, the one that finally cracked that comfortable assumption wide open, happened on a Saturday morning about 4 months before she eventually left. Mia had spent her entire morning cleaning, starting early, well before I was even awake. I woke up around 10, which was a fairly normal weekend wake-up time for me, and wandered into the living room to find her vacuuming, her hair pulled back, a bandana tied over it, sweat on her forehead even though it wasn't particularly warm out. "Morning," I said, stretching, heading toward the kitchen to make coffee. She didn't answer. I chalked it up to the vacuum noise and didn't think much of it. I made my coffee, sat down on the couch, and out of pure habit turned on my PlayStation. About 20 minutes later, she appeared in the doorway of the living room, vacuum cord still trailing behind her, and said, "Seriously?" I turned around, genuinely confused. "What?" She pointed at the vacuum, then gestured broadly at the apartment around her. "I've been cleaning for 3 hours. "I didn't ask you to," I said, and the second the words left my mouth, I felt something shift in the room, some instant, irreversible change in the air, even before I fully understood why. Her face didn't go angry, which somehow would have been easier to handle. It went into something else entirely, something that looked much more like disappointment, the specific kind of disappointment that comes from confirming a suspicion you've been hopping wasn't true. She turned off the vacuum, the sudden silence somehow louder than the noise had been. Then she said quietly, "That's exactly the problem." I didn't understand what she meant. I asked her to explain. She just shook her head and said she needed some air, and she left the apartment for almost 2 hours, taking Biscuit with her on what was clearly a much longer walk than his usual routine required. That night, after we'd both had time to cool down, Mia sat me down at our kitchen table with her laptop open. She had typed something up, and I remember being struck even in the moment by how calm and organized it was. It wasn't an angry rant. It wasn't a wall of accusatory text. It read almost clinically like a report, and somehow that made it hit even harder. The heading said, "Things I do that you don't think about." Underneath it was a list long enough that it filled most of the screen, and I remember scrolling down and feeling a slow, sinking realization build in my stomach as it kept going. Grocery shopping every week without fail, cooking most nights, laundry both hers and mine, cleaning, the deep cleaning, not just tidying up. Scheduling Biscuit's vet appointments and remembering his vaccination schedule, paying the vet bills and tracking which pet insurance claims had gone through, planning birthdays, not just hers but mine, and reminding me of important dates for my own family, buying gifts for my mother and my sister because she noticed early on that I tended to forget, and had quietly taken it over rather than let me disappoint them, remembering our friends' birthdays and coordinating plans around them, booking restaurant reservations whenever we went out, renewing our renter's insurance every year, calling the landlord about maintenance issues, buying household supplies, the unglamorous stuff, dish soap, paper towels, trash bags, the kind of thing you only notice when it runs out, planning our vacations, researching flights, comparing hotels, building itineraries, making sure we always had basic medicine in the house: cold medicine, pain relievers, bandages. Paying certain recurring bills that had at some point silently become hers to handle, keeping a running mental list of what around the apartment needed repairing and following up on it. At the bottom, she'd added one more line, not really a task, more of a summary. And I'm tired of being the person who notices everything. I stared at that screen for a long time, and then, God help me, I said something that I still cringe remembering. But I'll help, I told her. She looked at me and something in her expression made it immediately clear I'd said exactly the wrong thing, even though I still didn't fully understand why. Help, she repeated. Yeah, I said, with all of this I'll help more. She shook her head slowly. I don't need help, Ethan. She tapped the screen, pointing at the list. I need a partner. I sat with that sentence for a long time that night after she'd gone to bed, and even then I don't think I fully grasped the distinction she was drawing. I thought in my head that she was simply asking me to do more chores, to pitch in more evenly on the tasks that were currently unevenly distributed. That felt like a solvable problem, a concrete achievable goal, exactly the kind of thing my engineer brain was built to handle. Identify the deficiency, correct it, move on. So that's what I did. Over the following few weeks I started doing more chores visibly, deliberately. I washed dishes after dinner without being asked. I took the trash out proactively instead of waiting for her to remind me. I vacuumed on Saturday mornings before she had a chance to. I cooked dinner twice that first week, using recipes I looked up myself, proud of myself in a way that, looking back, feels almost embarrassing given how low a bar it actually was. And honestly, for a little while I thought I'd solved it. I thought I'd correctly diagnosed and fixed the problem. Then one evening, maybe 3 weeks into my sudden burst of household participation, I asked her, genuinely curious, "Are you happy now?" She looked at me for a long moment, longer than felt comfortable, before answering. "No," she said. That answer genuinely hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for. I'd changed my behavior, I'd been doing the dishes, I'd been vacuuming. Why wasn't that enough? I asked her, and she said after a pause, "Because I had to teach you how to notice me." That sentence stayed lodged in my head for weeks afterward, the way certain sentences do, resurfacing at random moments in the shower, on my commute, lying awake at night. I didn't fully understand it yet, not in any way I could have articulated, but something about it felt important in a way I couldn't shake. Around this time I decided I needed to do something bigger. Something that would prove, unambiguously, definitively, that I understood, that I was still a good boyfriend, that 6 years of my life hadn't been some slow accumulation of failures she'd only recently started cataloging. So I planned what I genuinely believed at the time was going to be the most romantic gesture of our entire relationship. I booked a table at the restaurant where we'd gone on our very first date, 6 years earlier, back when we were still nervous, still learning each other's coffee orders. It wasn't easy to get a reservation there anymore. The place had gotten a lot more popular since then, and I remember feeling proud of myself just for managing to secure the table. I bought her an enormous bouquet of the specific flowers she liked, peonies, which I actually did remember correctly, small victory that it was. I went to the jewelry store downtown and bought her a necklace, a delicate gold piece with a small pendant, one she'd mentioned once, almost a year earlier while we were window shopping, that she thought was beautiful. I'd remembered that too, filed it away without her ever knowing, and I felt an enormous swell of pride pulling it out of my memory for this moment. I even, and I want to emphasize how significant this felt to me at the time, turned off my PlayStation for an entire weekend, not touching it once, as a kind of silent, symbolic gesture. When she came home that Friday evening and saw the apartment, the flowers on the table, the reservation confirmation printed out next to them, the small jewelry box sitting beside her plate, she started crying almost immediately. I smiled. I remember feeling in that exact moment a wave of relief and satisfaction wash over me, the specific feeling of a problem finally, definitively solved. I thought, there it is, I fixed it. Then she looked up at me, tears still on her face, and said, "Ethan, this is exactly what I'm talking about." I genuinely did not understand. I stood there feeling the ground shift under me again, the same way it had that Saturday morning with the vacuum. She picked up the necklace box, opened it, looked at the pendant inside. "It's beautiful," she said. "Then what's wrong?" I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. She set the box down gently on the table. "You spent $600, she said, "trying to solve a problem that would have cost you nothing. What does that mean?" I asked, genuinely lost. She looked at me and I could see her searching for the right words, the way you do when you've explained something before and it hasn't landed and you're trying to find a new angle into the same idea. "I didn't want a necklace," she said. "Then what did you want?" she answered quietly. "I wanted you to notice I was exhausted before I had to tell you." That was the first moment, sitting there at our own kitchen table surrounded by flowers and an expensive necklace and a restaurant reservation I'd never even get to use, that I finally understood we hadn't actually been arguing about dishes this entire time, or laundry, or vet appointments. We'd been arguing about attention, about the difference between being given things and being seen. I didn't understand it fully yet, not in a way that translated into lasting behavioral change, but that night marked something. A shift in how I was starting to think about all of this, even if I still didn't know what to do with that shift. About a week after that dinner, I stumbled onto something that I still, to this day, feel a complicated mix of guilt and gratitude about discovering. Mia had left her laptop open on the kitchen counter while she went to take a shower, and I wasn't snooping, not really. I was just glancing at the screen while I refilled Biscuit's water bowl when I noticed a calendar application open that I didn't recognize. Our shared calendar, the one we both use for scheduling things together, was a different app entirely, one we'd set up years earlier. This was something else, a private calendar just for her. I know I shouldn't have looked closer, and I want to be honest that I did anyway, scrolling back through a few months out of a kind of anxious curiosity I couldn't quite suppress. It was full of the same categories of things from that list she'd typed up for me weeks earlier: doctor appointments, work deadlines, family birthdays, bill due dates, Biscuit's vaccination schedule. All of it meticulously tracked, color-coded by category, in a system that clearly represented months, maybe years, of quiet, invisible labor I had never once had to think about. And then near a date a few weeks out, I noticed something circled in red standing out sharply against the muted colors of everything else on the screen. September 14th, our anniversary. Underneath it, in her own handwriting, typed into the event notes, were two words: last chance. I stood there in our kitchen, water still running into Biscuit's bowl, overflowing slightly onto the counter, staring at those two words for what felt like a very long time. She hadn't told me she was considering leaving. She hadn't given me any explicit warning that our relationship had an expiration date circled on a calendar I wasn't supposed to see. She had apparently been quietly, privately deciding this, for weeks, maybe longer, entirely on her own, while I'd been walking around thinking that expensive necklace had bought us some kind of reset. I didn't confront her about what I'd seen. I told myself I would use the time before September 14th to actually change, not with grand gestures this time, but in the small, unglamorous, daily ways she'd been asking me to change all along. I want to be honest that some of that effort was genuine, and some of it, if I'm being fully truthful with myself even now, was driven by fear, by a kind of last-minute scrambling to avoid a deadline I now knew existed but wasn't supposed to know about. I started noticing things I'd never noticed before. I noticed that Mia sighed a specific way when she was tired but didn't want to make a thing of it. I noticed that she'd sometimes start folding laundry at 11 at night, after we'd already gone to bed, quietly slipping out to do it because she hadn't found time earlier in the day. I noticed, for the first time in longer than I want to admit, the actual weight of her exhaustion, visible in small ways I'd apparently trained myself not to see. I started doing things without being asked, not as a performance, not as a grand gesture, but quietly, the way she had always done things for me. I started keeping track of Biscuit's vet appointments myself, setting my own reminders instead of relying on her to remember for both of us. I started handling the landlord calls the same day an issue came up instead of putting it off. I picked up groceries on my way home twice without her having to ask or even mention it. It wasn't enough. Or rather, it wasn't enough in time. Our anniversary arrived on a Thursday. I had planned another big evening, more restrained this time, learning at least partially from the necklace mistake, but still a planned, intentional evening. A nice dinner reservation, candles at home beforehand, an attempt at showing her that I'd been trying. Mia came home that evening and I knew immediately something was wrong because she wasn't dressed for the dinner I'd planned. She was in the same clothes she'd worn to work that morning, and she was holding a cardboard box. I felt my stomach drop in a way I can still physically remember even now. "No," I said before she'd even said anything, some instinctive, desperate attempt to stop what I could already see coming. She started crying, standing there in our living room holding that box. "I can't do this anymore," she said. "Mia, I've been trying," I said, and I meant it desperately, even as I heard how insufficient it sounded even to my own ears. "I know," she said. "I've seen you trying." "Then why?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why now if you've seen me trying?" She looked at me and there was no anger in her face, which somehow made it so much worse, just a tired, resigned sadness. "Because you only started trying," she said, "when you realized you might lose me." I had no answer for that, because it was true and we both knew it was true and there was nothing I could say that would untrue it. She set the box down on the coffee table. Inside, I could see some of her clothes, a few books, a framed photo of the two of us from a trip we'd taken a few years earlier. 6 years, she said quietly, is a long time to slowly become lonely. And then she picked the box back up, walked past me and left, Biscuit whining softly by the door as she went, sensing something none of us fully wanted to name out loud. For the first few weeks after she moved out, I was, more than anything else, angry. Not sad, not yet, not in any way I could recognize as sadness. Angry. I told my friends she had overreacted. I told them with a kind of defensive intensity that I cringed to remember now that I had done everything for her. I actually pulled up photos on my phone, unprompted, showing them the apartment clean and organized, showing them pictures of the flowers and the necklace from that dinner, as if visual evidence could somehow settle the argument in my favor. I wasn't a terrible boyfriend, I kept saying to anyone who would listen, my voice getting a little more strained each time I said it, like I was trying to convince myself as much as anyone else. My best friend, a guy I'd known since college, sat with me one night while I went through this same routine again, and eventually he just listened quietly until I'd run out of steam. Then he asked me a few questions calmly, almost clinically. "Did she say you were terrible?" he asked. "No," I admitted. "Did she say you cheated?" No, did she say you didn't love her? I hesitated on that one longer than I wanted to. No, I finally said. He nodded slowly and then said something that landed harder than anything Mia herself had said to me in those final weeks. Then maybe, he said, you're defending yourself against an accusation she never actually made. I didn't have a response to that. I sat there in his living room, feeling something shift inside me. Some defensive wall I'd been building for weeks finally starting to crack under its own weight. The weeks that followed were in a lot of ways an education I hadn't asked for and desperately needed anyway. Living alone in that apartment for the first time in 6 years, I discovered piece by piece exactly how much of our shared life Mia had quietly been managing without my ever noticing the scale of it. The refrigerator, which had always simply, magically contained food, was suddenly empty within a few days, and I had to actually learn what a functional weekly grocery run looked like. Something I'd apparently never once had to think through on my own. I forgot to buy dog food for Biscuit twice in the first month, realizing only when his bowl was empty, and he was staring up at me with an expression that felt at the time like a very specific kind of judgment. The electricity bill, which I'd always vaguely assumed just got paid somehow, almost lapsed into a late fee because I genuinely didn't know the due date, having never once had to track it myself. I couldn't remember our Wi-Fi password, the actual password, not the one printed on a sticker somewhere, because Mia had changed it at some point for security reasons and had simply updated all our devices herself without it ever crossing my radar. I didn't know when Biscuit's next vaccination was due, because that entire tracking system had lived entirely in Mia's head and on that private calendar I'd stumbled onto. I couldn't remember which brand of laundry detergent she always bought, the specific one that didn't irritate my skin, something she'd apparently quietly kept track of for years without me ever once thinking to ask how she knew. I genuinely could not remember, standing in the empty aisle of a grocery store one Tuesday evening feeling more lost than I expected, buying toilet paper to make me feel, the last time I had personally purchased toilet paper for our apartment in 6 years of living together. And somewhere in the middle of all of that quiet, humbling discovery, it finally clicked into place for me, the thing Mia had been trying to explain for months. I hadn't been helping Mia run our life together. Mia had been running our life almost entirely on her own, and occasionally generously inviting me to participate in small, visible pieces of it, pieces I then took as evidence that I was contributing my fair share. About 3 months after she moved out, Mia came back to the apartment to collect the rest of her belongings, the things she hadn't taken in that first rushed departure. I helped her pack, mostly in silence, both of us being careful and polite with each other in the specific way people are when they still care about each other but no longer know exactly what shape that caring is supposed to take. While she was going through a drawer in the desk we used to share, she found the old list, the one she'd typed up and shown me months earlier, which I'd printed out at some point without telling her and kept folded in that drawer. She picked it up and something crossed her face, a small, sad smile. "You still have it?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. She unfolded it, scanning down the page, and then she paused, noticing something I'd added to it weeks after our breakup in a different pen. Not chores this time, questions. What does Mia need when she's stressed, and how can I tell before she has to tell me? When was the last time I asked about her day, and actually listened to the answer instead of waiting for my turn to talk? What things does she do for us that I automatically assume will just happen on their own? What does she enjoy that she used to talk about that I've stopped noticing or asking about? She looked up at me, holding the page. "Why did you write these?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. I told her as honestly as I could manage. "Because I finally understood I'd been treating our relationship like a service I was paying into," I said, "instead of something I was actually responsible for maintaining." She didn't say anything right away. She just looked down at the page again, and then without warning she started crying, standing there in the middle of our old shared apartment holding a piece of paper covered in questions I should have been asking her years earlier. I thought in that moment foolishly that this was it. That this was the moment where everything turned around, where 6 years of history and this visible, undeniable proof of my growth would be enough to bring her back. It wasn't. And in a strange, painful way that turned out to be the final, most important lesson of this entire experience, she told me once she composed herself, "I believe you've changed." "Then why can't we try again?" I asked, my voice breaking on the question in a way I wasn't able to control. She smiled at me then, a small, sad, genuine smile, tears still on her face. "Because I don't want to be the reward for your personal growth," she said. That sentence destroyed me in a way I don't think I've fully recovered from even now a year later, because she wasn't punishing me. I understood that clearly even in the moment, even through the devastation of hearing it. She wasn't trying to make me suffer or make me jealous or hold some kind of grudge over my head as leverage. She wasn't secretly seeing someone else at the time, not yet. She simply, calmly, had decided that she didn't want to spend another 6 years of her life waiting to find out whether the change I was showing her in that moment would actually last, or whether it would quietly erode back into old patterns the moment the immediate threat of losing her had passed. It's been about a year now since that day in the apartment. I'm still single. I still play PlayStation, and I want to be very clear about that because I think it matters. I didn't quit gaming entirely as some kind of penance, some symbolic sacrifice offered up in hopes that it would prove something. Gaming was never actually the villain in this story, no matter how easy it would be to tell it that way. I still play with the same group of friends I've had since college, sometimes for 3 hours on a Saturday, sometimes for 30 minutes on a weeknight when I need to decompress after a hard day. The actual difference isn't the amount of time I spend gaming. It's what I do in the moments when someone I care about needs something from me. I no longer automatically say after this game as some kind of reflexive unconscious deferral. I've learned to actually pause literally and figuratively and ask, what needs to be done right now? And I've learned that sometimes the honest answer to that question isn't a task at all. Sometimes it's simply, sit with me for a minute. And I understand now, in a way I genuinely didn't before, that showing up for that kind of request matters just as much, maybe more, than showing up for a chore. I've also spent a fair amount of this past year in therapy, which is something I probably should have started years earlier if I'm being honest. My therapist has helped me understand something I don't think I could have articulated on my own, which is that I had grown up in a lot of ways, watching a household where the invisible labor of running a family fell almost entirely on one parent, without it ever being named or examined, and that I had absorbed that pattern as simply how things worked, without ever consciously choosing it. Understanding that hasn't excused what happened between Mia and me. But it has helped me understand why I was so genuinely blind to something that, looking back now, seems almost impossible to have missed. A little over a year after the breakup, I ran into Mia at a coffee shop near our old apartment, the kind of coincidental run-in you always hear about happening in a city big enough that it shouldn't, and yet somehow does anyway. We ended up talking for about 20 minutes, standing near the counter while our drinks got made, both of us a little awkward at first, then settling into something more comfortable as the conversation went on. She looked happy. Genuinely happy in a way that was visible in small things, the way she carried herself, the ease in her posture that I hadn't fully realized had been missing for a long time before she left. I asked her carefully if she was seeing anyone. She smiled. Yeah, she said. I smiled too, and I want to be honest that it took real effort, but it wasn't a performance. I was actually glad for her underneath the ache of hearing it. Good, I said, I'm glad. Before she left, drink in hand, she paused and said, I'm glad you're doing better. I almost told her in that moment that I still loved her. The words were right there, sitting in my throat, and some old, familiar part of me wanted badly to say them out loud to see what would happen if I did. Instead, I said, I'm glad you're happy. And I meant it fully, without any hidden agenda underneath it, without hoping the sentence would somehow open a door back to something that had already closed. She smiled once more, and then she walked out of the coffee shop and back into the rest of her life, a life that for the first time in 6 years I was not a central part of. And standing there watching her go, I realized something that took me a long time to fully arrive at. I didn't need anything from her anymore, not forgiveness, not another chance. Not reassurance that I'd been a good enough boyfriend somewhere underneath all my mistakes. I just wanted her to be okay, genuinely, simply, without complication. That's when I finally understood the actual shape of what had happened between us, the thing I'd spent so many months getting wrong in my own head. The saddest part of this whole story was never really that Mia left because I played too many video games. That was always the surface explanation, the easy headline version of events that let me avoid looking at the actual problem underneath it. She left because over 6 years, without ever intending to, without ever once thinking of myself as anything other than a loyal, loving partner, I had spent that entire time waiting for her to explicitly tell me what she needed, instead of becoming the kind of person who paid close enough attention to notice on my own. I wish, more than almost anything else in my adult life, that I had understood that distinction while she was still there to see me understand it. Instead, it took her becoming, in a lot of painful ways, a stranger again before I finally learned the lesson she'd apparently been trying to teach me for the better part of a year. Edit: a lot of people in the comments are asking whether I think Mia was right to leave, or whether I think she should have communicated more clearly, sooner, instead of quietly building up resentment for months before finally saying something. Honestly, I've turned that question over in my head more times than I can count over the past year, and I don't think there's a clean answer. I think she probably could have said something sooner and more directly, and I think, if I'm being fully honest with myself, that even if she had, I'm not sure I would have actually heard it the way it needed to be heard, not until I was forced to live without her and see in very concrete terms exactly what she'd been carrying the entire time. I don't say that to excuse myself, I say it because I think it's the most honest answer I have. Edit 2: to the people asking if Biscuit is doing okay, yes, he's still with me and he's doing great. Mia and I actually coordinated on that decision amicably, one of the few conversations in this whole process that never got complicated. She sees him sometimes when we're both comfortable arranging it, and honestly, watching the two of them together during those visits was part of what helped me finally understand what it actually looks like when someone shows up fully present for another living creature, instead of showing up distracted, half attention on a screen, thinking that presence and participation were the same thing. Edit 3: I know some of you are going to ask, so I'll just say it now. No, I don't think there's a version of this story where we get back together down the line. I've made peace with that, mostly. What I've tried to hold on to instead is the version of myself I became by finally learning this lesson, even though I learned it too late to save the relationship it was meant for. I'd like to think that version of me is worth something, even now, even without her here to see it.